Hi everyone, welcome to the next video on the causes of the current account deficit. All right, so remember before we get started, the current account is the area of international transactions with no future financial obligation. And we've got our good friend here to help us through this particular area, which is a little bit challenging, but once you go over it, it shouldn't be too difficult. So please feel free to pause this video at key moments and go over them until you fully understand. But before we get started, we want to do a recap on this concept of debit or credit. You might remember from earlier, I gave you guys a little trick of when you use your debit card at the shops, which way does the money flow from your bank account? Well, it leaves your bank account. So a debit is when money leaves the country, a credit is when money comes in. So our first example here is, I think that's iron, one of our key exports. And then one way you've got to find the flow of money is find the flow of the good, or the direction, sorry, of the good or the service, and the money flows the other way. So for example, when coal goes over to China, well, when it's not going to give them that for free, in return, they're going to give us money. Okay, so the money is flowing into the country. Therefore, when we sell coal to China, that is considered a credit on the current account. Okay, and it's a current on the current account, don't forget, because that transaction has no future financial obligation. All right, next one. This time we're going to buy a car from China, where most cars are made. Again, they're just not going to give us that for free. We are going to pay China for that, and so the money is going to leave the country. And so when the money leaves the country, this is recorded as a debit. Now, this transaction of the purchase of a car, once the car, Mazda in this case, Mazda Australia, has paid for that car, that transaction has no future financial obligation to those two parties, so it goes on the current account. Next one, this can be a little bit tricky, so I thought I'd put this one in as an example, is the payment of dividends. So here we've got a company, Google, which is based in America, and let's say there's an Australian who holds shares in Google. Well, as a return for the Australian's investment, they're going to want some profit down the line, and so those profits are referred to as dividends. It kind of sounds like the word divide. So, and that's exactly what it means. It's all the profit divided by all of the shareholders. So when that profit or dividend comes into Australia, well, that's actually recorded as a credit on the current account because the money has come in. Now you might say to yourself, but hang on a minute, I thought that to me looks like a transaction with a future financial obligation. And here where you've got to be really careful to separate the initial investment in Google from the dividend that the investors get for investing in Google. So that initial buying of the shares, whenever that Australian bought those shares from Google, well, our Australian dollars would have left the country. So therefore, that would have been recorded as a debit, but on the capital and financial side. So the buying of the shares actually does have a future financial obligation, but the issuing of the dividend here doesn't. Okay, so when the dividend is issued, that actually gets recorded in the current account. So try to separate the initial investment from the return on the investment. And another one, okay, so we've got an American student who's coming over to Australia to study. Now, here you might be like, oh, she has come over, and so therefore the money goes the other way, but the money is going to come from America into Australia. Okay, so just follow the flow of money, and that will tell you whether it's a debit or a credit. All right, so if the money flows into Australia, then this is a credit, okay, because the money came in. If we're still getting a little mixed up on the debits or credits, then go over these examples again, and repetition in the learning activities that I've given you guys for this will play a big part in understanding and getting a good understanding of what is a debit or a credit. All right, now we're going to get to the main section for this particular video, which is the causes of the current account deficits. Now, this is often an area that is a lot of the times misunderstood, and it is a bit tricky, so I'll try and simplify it for you. Just have a look in the top right-hand corner of the screen though, and I'm just reminding you about the way that I'd like you to think of the balance of payments. Yeah, remember you've got the balance of payments, which is the collection of all international financial transactions. but then we split them by current account and capital and financial account. The ones that go into the current account have no future financial obligation, and the ones that go into the capital and financial account do. So when we have a current account, so here's the seesaw. If we have a current account deficit, if current account here is below that imaginary zero line, it means we've got more debits than credits. That is the normal position for Australia. Is like what you see on your screen there and what you can see on my hands here. We normally, on the current account, have more money leaving the country than coming in. And on the capital and financial account, we normally have more money coming into the country than leaving. All right, and so as a result, this is a specific area of the study design. And then so here, they're not listed in the study design what the causes are, except for these two categories of structural and cyclical. So that's what we're going to go through here. Your textbook goes into a lot of detail on a lot of them. I'm only going to give you a couple of them because really you only need to talk about one or two structural or one or two cyclical in your answers, and you just pick the one you're most comfortable with or the one that one that applies best to the question. So let's start with structural. And I want you to kind of think of, gotta find my pens. Just bear with me. All right, is that pen gonna work? Hopefully. Okay, so I want you to think, and I think your textbook does a good job of this too, is the two causes of the current account deficit. Remember, this is more money leaving the country than coming in on the current account. So we're just talking current account now. Is I want you to kind of see it as kind of two sections. Yeah. And the first one I draw is kind of like a little bit of a block down the bottom. And this is your structural. Structural. Yeah, if you think of the structural part of a house, it's the way that it is made up. Yeah, it's hard to change, and there's not really much you can do about it. And if you buy a house with poor structural elements to it, well, you're just gonna have to suck it up. Yeah, there's not much you can do. Over time, though, you could chip away and change the structure of the house. And just like the house example, with the current account, we can also, over time, change the structural component of the current account deficit, or the CAD, as we'll probably call it. Yeah, the structural, the way that Australia's economy is. Yeah, and that is really closely linked with the aggregate supply side of the economy. Yeah, the way that our economy, the supply side of our economy is structured. Okay, so what are some of those ways? Well, let's have a look into a couple of them. So one reason why we have more money leaving the country than coming in on the current account is, well, we've got what's called a savings investment imbalance. Yeah, so what does this mean? Well, we've got a lot of natural resources here in Australia, but we've got a small relative population for the resources that we have. And then so in order to fully, I don't want to use the word exploit, but utilize is probably a better word, utilize those resources, we need investment from other countries to fund the use of those particular resources. And I'm talking, mining is a really great example of this. We don't have enough savings in this country, in Australian bank accounts, to invest in building these big infrastructure projects. And so as a result, we have to borrow money from overseas to do them. Now, that's awesome because we get to utilize those resources we have in the economy. But since we've borrowed money from overseas to do those things, well, we've got to pay back interest and profits back to those overseas who have invested in those Australian projects. And it's those interest repayments that go onto the current account and are recorded as a debit because it's money leaving. The more money we borrow, then, well, the more money we're going to have to pay back on the current account. That's just a basic fundamental structural component of how we are as an economy based on the resources we have and the level of savings that we have, the low level of savings we have. The other structural reason is we have what's called low relative labor productivity. All right, now that concept of productivity is about, well, how well we can extract output from the resources that we've got. And in Australia, we have high wages. Yeah, so that's really great for living standards for those working in Australia. But when we compare ourselves to other countries around the world, our wages are quite high, and wages being a key cost of production means then we have higher export prices and we're less internationally competitive as a result. So you get, and that totally explains the reasons why, for example, we don't make cars in Australia anymore. It's because we're just not cost effective. And since we're not exporting as much because we're more expensive, well, there's less credits on the current account. So when we have our, our seesaw like this, and we've got the current account, we can't really see the current account on this side here. If we got more credits, well, that would kind of help swing the seesaw back up this way. Those credits aren't coming in. The money is not coming into the country because we're not selling as much as we possibly could if our wages were lower. So that's the structural side. I think the structural side is the harder one to understand, so please feel free to go over that if anything's unclear. And then we have the cyclical. So if we go back to my terrible little drawing thing, if the structural component is the foundation of the economy, well, the cyclical one is kind of like it goes up and down depending on the business cycle. And that's your link here to understanding the cyclical point. CSCI, cyclical, and that's aggregate demand, yeah? Okay, and that's the aggregate demand side. When the economic cycle, the business cycle is high, yeah, that's going to have a particular effect on the current account deficit, and when it's low, it's also going to have another effect. So let's go into the three things that kind of cause this. The first one is the overvalued exchange rate. So when we have an exchange rate which is too high, what that's going to do is our exports are going to be relatively expensive compared to other countries, and then there's going to be less credits on the current account, making the current account deficit bigger. That's kind of not something that's really happening at the moment. So that's more of a theoretical one that we've got. Another one at the moment is when there is strong aggregate demand growth, we buy more imports. And how this works is, well, when aggregate demand rises, incomes also rise. And when we have more money as an economy, what do we generally do? Well, we spend it. We might save a bit, but we generally spend it. We're going to increase our domestic consumption, absolutely, but we're also going to import more stuff. If you have more money, you might be more inclined to go on that overseas holiday, or you might buy that second pair of shoes online. And when we buy more stuff, and when we import more stuff, sorry, well, the good comes in and the money leaves. So when we import more, well, then that's more debits on the current account, increasing the current account deficit and moving that seesaw further down. And then the final one here is key trading partner declines. And again, this is all in relation to the business cycle. So in a business cycle where the economic growth of a key trading partner declines, like has happened at the moment with what's happening in China and other areas around the world, well, then they're going to buy less of our stuff. And so if we have, let's say, China over here and Australia here, yeah, if China's buying less stuff from us, well, then there's less money coming in as a result of that. And if there's less money coming in, well, then there's going to be less credits on our on our current account. And so what normally those exports that we sell would help, bring this seesaw back to balance, but we're not getting that money back in. So we're going further and further and further into deficit when our overseas trading partners aren't experiencing good rates of economic growth. Because when they're growing, they're buying our stuff, especially things like raw commodities. So there's a lot in this video, guys, especially on this last slide. So please go back and watch it, maybe the whole thing twice, and pausing and taking some notes in some key areas. But hopefully this can help you understand why, as a country, our balance of payments looks like that, with the current account in deficit and the capital and financial account in surplus. Any other questions? Reach out. Otherwise, happy learning. Thanks.